Hi, I'm David Klion. I'm a senior editor at Blogging Heads TV. This is an episode of Worldwise, and I'm talking to Professor Anatol Lieven. Anatol, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor in the War Studies Department of King's College London and a senior fellow of the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and I'm author, among other books, of Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry.
Great, and we are going to be talking about Ukraine and Russia today, of course. They've been in the news a lot recently because Russia is currently occupying the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine and has indicated that it might consider moving to other parts of Ukraine as well, although that seems to have slowed down. We'll discuss that. But before we do that, I wanted to get a general, the main purpose of this conversation is to get a look at Vladimir Putin's strategy in Ukraine. So I want to say a number of Russia watchers recently, such as Julia Yaffe in the New Republic, have suggested that Putin may have lost his mind, or that he's been losing touch with reality for a few years now. And they'll cite an interview he gave last week on RT where he seemed a little strange. We're not going to psychoanalyze Putin in this conversation, but based purely on his foreign policy, especially with regard to Ukraine, but maybe in general as well, do you believe that the president of Russia is behaving rationally? And if so, what is his strategy?
The thing is that it's extremely foolish to personalize this around Putin, let alone to suggest that he's lost his mind. If you look at the writings of large parts of the Russian establishment, including people who, although within the establishment, are very much on the liberal side, there has been a universal call for action to what has happened in Ukraine from the Russian establishment as a whole. Now, there are certain differences, of course, about tactics, but first, Ukraine is defined by everybody, good relations or close relations with Ukraine, as a vital Russian interest. The Russian establishment as a whole, and actually the greater part of the Russian people, have reacted extremely badly to attempts to take Ukraine into an anti-Russian alliance by the West.
By which you mean NATO?
Yes, but the European Union is increasingly seen in this light as well, especially given the events of the past 6 months or so. And the overthrow of the government in Kiev is seen as completely illegitimate. Remembering that this was an elected government, quite unlike what happened in Egypt or in Eastern Europe in 1989 or whatever, and that the agreement by which the government stayed in power, in return for holding early elections and so forth, which was overturned 2 days later, by the demonstrators, had after all been signed by the United States and by Russia and by the European Union. So, this was clearly seen from Russia, the breach of an international agreement, apart from anything else. Finally, Russia feels that, and I'm talking about Russia here, you understand, the Russian state, not just Putin. Yes. The Russian state feels that the head of the demonstrations in Kiev have been extreme nationalist and even neo-fascist groups, denounced as such, by the way, by the European Parliament 2 years ago, in case of Svoboda, that they have taken a role in the new government which does threaten the rights and interests of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. Now, there are tactical differences about how to respond to that, and within the Russian establishment there are people who say that Russia could have waited before acting in Crimea, or that it could have taken over militarily, but not backed this referendum on joining Russia and so forth. But that Russia had to react is not an issue in the Russian establishment.
Right. Well, as a matter of, let's say, international law, or just good strategy. I'm having a strange echo now. I don't know why. But do you think that Russia might have, that there might have been a diplomatic tack that Russia could have taken prior to sending troops to the Crimea? For example, were there opportunities for Crimea to achieve more autonomy or even independence from Ukraine through constitutional processes in conjunction with the new government in Kiev? Was there an emergency of any sort, oppression of Russian speakers, let's say, to justify immediate Russian military intervention, in your opinion?
No, I don't think that there was an actual need for immediate action. I mean, clearly, as Russia has demonstrated, it was in a position to take the peninsula when it wanted anyway.
And without a shot fired.
So far, without a shot fired, thank God. Um, Now, there was no possibility of independence by a constitutional route because it's ruled out by the existing Ukrainian constitution. Anyway, the authorities in Kiev would never agree. Enhanced autonomy was taken back, was cancelled by Kiev in the 1990s. So that would undoubtedly also have been rejected by the new government in Kiev, but of course it would have been a much more limited Russian step than the one that they have taken. So, I mean, I'm not saying that from my own point of view, I think that Russia's actions are correct. But you have to remember, I mean, a number of things that happened. You remembered the famous or infamous intercepted telephone call of Victoria Nuland about America's role.
Yes. Would you care to quote what she said about the European Union recently?
No, I won't. Not on. You know, but I mean, clearly, I'm surprised the Europeans aren't more angry about this, let alone the Russians. Secondly, there was that conversation in which the Estonian foreign minister, and he's confirmed this, raised suspicions that some at least of the killings in the square by snipers may have been carried out as a provocation by the opposition itself, not by the Ukrainian government.
Wow.
Now, the point is that seen from Russia, there was simply no point in seeking a diplomatic path with the West. The West had just overturned itself every rule of international behavior.
Well, actually, so let's talk about that a little bit. In addition to maintaining that this is a coup, the overthrow of Yanukovych, who was indeed democratically elected several years ago, close election, but still.
I believe most American elections are close.
Well, yes,
That's
of course.
Makes them legitimate.
And America, much like Ukraine, is a regionally divided country where anyone who gets elected is usually regarded as illegitimate in half the country, or that's how it's been in recent years.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, in addition to maintaining this as a coup, Russia has, and that the protesters are fascist to some extent, Russia has also maintained that this, as well as previous the previous events of 2004, the Orange Revolution, and similar events in Georgia, were orchestrated by the United States and Europe, by the CIA, via non-government organizations. How much evidence is there that this is true?
Well, on the coup, that is not correct. I mean, this was a popular uprising. Mm-hmm. On the composition of the demonstrations, they were a mixture. I mean, clearly, the majority of the demonstrators, wanted Western reform and wanted to get rid of, their corrupt government, and of course wanted to oppose the deal to bring Ukraine into the Eurasian Union. But I mean, it's absolutely obvious, especially among the demonstrators who did the fighting. If you look, well, I mean, there have been plenty of interviews with these people, the flags and so forth. That there was one outright neo-fascist group, the Pravi right sector, and then there was Svoboda, which now has a very prominent part in the new government, including the Ministry of Justice and the Secretaryship of the National Security Council. And they were characterized in 2012 by the European Parliament as an ultra-nationalist, xenophobic and anti-Semitic party, and the European Parliament urged other Ukrainian parties not to form alliances with these people. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the truth lies somewhere in between. I mean, this was, as far as Western backing was concerned, well, I think that conversation of Nuland's makes that absolutely clear that America was playing a leading role. That doesn't mean that America began by orchestrating it. But, I mean, the fact that there was an American role in what happened is perfectly obvious. No?
How does that role manifest itself specifically? I mean, obviously a lot of this is secret, but as I guess this is somewhat speculative, but I mean, we know that, John McCain likes to show up and pose whenever there's a revolution, but of course, he's mostly doing that, I think, to present himself a certain way. And in any case, he's obviously not in the Obama administration, far from it. How would the actual U.S. government, the CIA, the White House, by what means, prior to Yanukovych's overthrow, when they've started reaching out diplomatically in public, how might they assist something like these demonstrations in Maidan?
Well, I think in two ways. I mean, the first is that if you go back to the Orange Revolution, there is, considerable evidence that United States NGOs, now these are NGOs, not in themselves, this isn't state money as such, but
well, we could name some names here, right? Some of these organizations: the National Democratic Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy,
yeah,
groups like that,
which
yeah.
are congressionally funded.
Yes.
So, I mean, they have shall we say, ambiguous relationship to the American state. And they did contribute with actual funds to the propaganda and even to the logistics of the demonstrations in 2004. Now, what happened this time, we're not sure, of course, but given the history, it would not surprise one. But secondly, I think what one can well imagine is that there were guarantees from the United States to the leaders of the opposition that if they got rid of Yanukovych and formed a new government, America, would recognize that government and would be prepared to step up with aid. I'm not, of course, I can't say for sure that that did happen, but if you're looking at ways that America could have supported the opposition, that's one obvious one, because otherwise they would have found themselves in a hopeless position after overthrowing the government and seizing power. Right. A wrecked economy, no international recognition, and no money.
Right. Now regarding Yanukovych, actually, and his overthrow, it's interesting that even people who regard this as a coup, and I would say this goes straight up to Putin himself, no one seems to much like Yanukovych or think he was any good as a leader. We saw his garish palace, and we know that he and the people around him seem to have looted the treasury. We know he was kind of a criminal and a thug prior to even getting elected. And his gunning down of demonstrators in the Maidan would sort of speak for itself.
Hang on a second.
Yes.
From the conversation with the Estonian foreign minister, once again, there are real ambiguities about who was gunning down whom. The second thing in the West is that it's been completely forgotten that 16 policemen were also killed. Now, one presumes they didn't shoot themselves.
Sure.
Right?
No, there's good evidence that some of the demonstrators did turn violent. And I wouldn't comment here on who did what first. But I guess what I really meant to ask was, well, first of all, how did a guy like Yanukovych, I kind of know the answer to this, but how did a guy like Yanukovych manage to get elected president of Ukraine in the first place? And regardless of how he was actually overthrown, I mean, were there legitimate grievances on the part of the people in the Maidan, and should some new political order have supplanted Yanukovych? Maybe not through these means, but what might they have done instead?
Well, I mean, I believe it's technically known as democracy.
Yeah.
You have a rotten government, and you throw it out at the next elections, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as why Yanukovych won, well, there are obviously two reasons. I mean, one is that Ukraine is deeply politically divided. Every election has shown that.
Yes.
I mean, the point is, it's not just that Yanukovych was elected by a narrow margin. At previous elections, the other side was elected by very narrow margins as well.
Right. The Orange Revolution was triggered by a very closely disputed election between Yushchenko and Yanukovych. So yes.
Yeah. But the point is, the election that followed that, which the Orange forces won, was also very narrow. I mean, you're talking about shifts within a very narrow spectrum. That, of course, is what makes Ukraine so dangerous, because there is this deep division. But the second thing, I mean, why did Yanukovych, having been overthrown in 2004, why was he re-elected in 2010? Well, because the other side had made such a mess of things. This, unfortunately, is the story, of course, of much of the world. I spend quite a lot of my time looking at Bangladesh. I mean, not that I want to say Ukraine is as bad as Bangladesh, but you look at the two main parties in Bangladesh, and you ask, why in hell, given that each of them has failed repeatedly, to reform and develop the country, why do Ukrainians vote for them? Why do they keep voting first for one side and one the other? Well, the answer is that there isn't anybody else to vote for.
Right. And of course, the most of the major political leaders of the past decade in Ukraine, Yushchenko, Yulia Tymoshenko, who was just freed from prison and is trying to restart her political career, and Yanukovych are all notoriously corrupt. It's a very corrupt country, much like
Absolutely.
Russia. But I guess I would also ask, I mean, so Yanukovych obviously represented the interests of the eastern and southern parts of the country that are more predominantly Russian-speaking, and was opposed in the western part of the country that's more Ukrainian-speaking. As I wrote recently for Al Jazeera America, there is a large middle part of the country that doesn't fit neatly into either of those categories, but we'll table that for now. What did Yanukovych have to offer the Russian-speaking parts of the country? Why did they support him, and do they still support him?
Well, it seems, I mean, how far they still support him is not at all clear. But, I mean, remember that, the reason he was overthrown was not just opposition to his signing, of this partnership with Russia or with the Eurasian Union. I mean, it was also because, of course, his government had been so incompetent and corrupt. So, I mean, it does look by opinion polls as if his support had diminished very steeply in the eastern and southern regions as well, which is no doubt also why people didn't come out, much more on the streets to defend him. But as far as, I mean, what he offers to the Russian-speaking populations of those areas, well, I mean, it would be first defense of their culture, their language, and their regional interests against other versions of Ukrainian identity, which are both quite different and deeply hostile to them, if you look, including, as I say, I mean, major elements of the new government in Kiev. And then, of course, the Yanukovych regime was propped up by businessmen, oligarchs, if you will, from those regions, who, in a typical oligarchical fashion, take a lot out of those regions, but also distribute it back in various ways, through patronage and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that over the past week, the new government in Kiev has moved to appoint oligarchs of its own to senior positions in the east and south, so as to try to reconcile the populations there. But of course, that suggests that, well, we all knew that economic reform was going to be very difficult. I mean, that begins to suggest that it may actually be impossible, because the fragmented nature of the society does not allow it. You have too many groups that you have to reconcile and buy off.
Right. Well, so let's talk about how the situation is going to proceed going forward. Last week you wrote an article basically saying the West should be cautious. I just had an article on Friday in the New Republic arguing against the overheated Nazi metaphors that we've heard from Hillary Clinton and John McCain and others, and instead suggesting as a possible historical precedent, it's not a perfect one, but the Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus, which I cited because Cyprus was an ethnically divided country that Turkey intervened in response to a coup 40 years ago, and ever since they have, unrecognized by any other country, they have occupied the northern part of the country, which they've made more homogeneously Turkish. The southern part is Greek. The southern part of the country has joined the European Union 10 years ago, and there hasn't been an outbreak of violence. We've just kind of had this pseudo-state in northern Cyprus, and it's a sort of a non-Soviet frozen conflict. So I suggested...
And by the way, and Turkey has remained a member of NATO.
It has. And in fact, one interesting detail I learned when researching the piece is that northern Cyprus has passports that are recognized by, I think, 10 countries, obviously one of which is Turkey, 2 of which are the United States and the United Kingdom, and I think also Australia, who I guess are doing that as a favor to Turkey. But if northern Cypriots want to travel anywhere else, they go to Turkey and they get Turkish passports, so it works out. So basically, this is a situation that, I mean, it was initially violent when they invaded, but that's basically just been frozen for 40 years. The Greeks are outraged, the Greek Cypriots are outraged. The world doesn't recognize it, but we sort of live with it. That was my maybe optimistic assessment of what might happen with Crimea going forward, but what do you think about that, and what are some other scenarios we might be concerned about?
Well, if it were just Crimea, I think that is very much the way it will go, because after all, the West has made absolutely clear it's not going to fight. The Ukrainian army would be crazy, to try to retake Crimea by military force. The border is, obvious, it's a peninsula, so it can be isolated. And if it were just Crimea, I wouldn't actually worry. I mean, there will be, of course, tremendous shouting on both sides. But no, that doesn't have to lead to anything serious at all.
The shouting could even be good for the new government in Kiev, right? I mean, they get to look aggrieved without actually fighting a war, and they get to solicit Western aid. It's
very much so. But the problem, of course, is what happens in eastern and southern Ukraine, and to the country as a whole. And because now you have these nationalist militias, which are dominating certain areas of the west of the country. We're not clear just what Russia is doing to support volunteer groups or militias in the east of the country. But if Russia, if you have a situation in which you, partly because of the collapse of the police and the leakage of arms, you actually have armed nationalist militias in the west, and you have Russian armed militias in the east. And then in May, you have an election campaign, which the Russians and at least some Ukrainians in the east and south are likely to denounce the Russians will certainly denounce as illegitimate. Mm-hmm. There is, of course, massive opportunities for rigging in several areas. And that can lead to an ongoing crisis of legitimacy for Ukraine as a whole. But secondly, of course, there is the possibility that these different armed groups will actually, come into violent conflict with each other. Then there is the whole question of, who wins the elections? And if a nationalist government does move, as the parliament tried once before, actually to restrict the right, the linguistic rights of Russian speakers, or if you have a situation in which places in the east and south make a bid, for the federalization of the country, for autonomy, there are at least chances, one can't say how great they are, of the situation as a whole developing in a very unstable and violent way.
And that could have dangerous implications well beyond Ukraine. I mean, that could have global implications for U.S.-Russian and Russian-European relations. Can you talk about what those might be?
Well, if there's a full-scale war, because if one saw a situation in which, you had actually mass violence in Ukraine, with Russian speakers being killed, especially if there were pro-Russian militias which were defeated, or the Ukrainian army intervened to crush them, then I think there would be a very good chance of Russian invasion. Well, then you have a full-scale war.
Right.
You have the partition of the country.
Which would you agree with me that partition in general, whether it's through war or through any other means, would be a very negative outcome?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, a terrible outcome.
Yeah.
A terrible outcome. Then you would have, I think, Russia really would be isolated from the West. There would have to be economic sanctions to which Russia would, respond in various ways. So that is the scenario that worries me really, and that's why we have to try to get the whole Ukrainian process back. To some extent, the point is everybody's focusing on Crimea, but I think Crimea to a degree has to be shelved now, and we have to work, on trying to restore legitimacy to the Ukrainian electoral process as a whole.
Right.
And also, undoubtedly, since it's got so involved already, the West will, I think, have to become more and more open about political involvement in Ukraine, because it's quite clear that I'm not saying that the role of the West has been by no means entirely negative. It was Western influence behind the scenes which got the president to block, not to sign the new language law which the parliament passed, stripping Russian and other minority languages of their official status. But my sense is that we will probably have to become more and more involved in actually managing the political process within Ukraine, because the risks otherwise for all of us are simply too high.
Now, should Ukraine in the long run, what originally kind of kicked off this crisis was that Yanukovych had been flirting with the idea of signing an agreement with the European Union that would move Ukraine, an inch closer to membership one day in theory, and then Putin told him don't do that, and he pulled back, and that kicked off the initial demonstrations. Now, in the very long run, should Ukraine ever join the European Union? Should it join a Eurasian Union with Putin? Should it not join anything? What's the? I mean, does Ukraine need to be aligned in Europe?
Mm. Well, I think it's quite clear that Ukraine, as a whole, cannot join the Eurasian Union. I mean, what was proved in Kiev is that large numbers of Ukrainians will fight to the death to prevent that, to prevent joining a bloc under Russia. So that is over. Russia's hopes in that regard are dead. As far as the European Union is concerned, well, it's not so much should it as actually can it. Can it in any foreseeable future, given the state of its economy, given, it must be said, the state of the European economies, as well, after the recession. Putin didn't just tell Yanukovych to join the Eurasian Union. He offered him $15 billion up front.
He did do that.
And a 30% drop in the gas price, which amounts to an annual subsidy of billions of dollars more. Right. Now, that was vastly in excess, by well over an order of magnitude than anything that the European Union was offering at that time. Now, of course, the European Union and the West is offering $15 billion. How long can we keep that up? How long are we willing to keep that up?
Well, look, one good question is how long could Putin have kept that up? I mean, is Putin? I guess that this should probably be the last question, and then we should go. But I understand? I think it's well understood the sort of historical reasons, the nationalistic reasons why Putin and, as you said, the whole Russian establishment want to maintain control over Ukraine or influence over Ukraine. But from a purely kind of materialist geostrategic perspective, I mean, is this any good for Russia to get drawn into kind of, maintaining its hegemony over Ukraine? Does it? I mean, can the Russian economy afford this? Is the diplomatic cost worth it? I mean, is this actually wise what they're doing?
Look, I'm a historian. Speaking of what is wise and what is not wise, you referred to Cyprus.
Yes.
A country, in which there are more than 10 million of your co-ethnics, which has been linked to your country in one way or another for 1,200 years, where some of the greatest battles, in your history were fought against, what you at least see as invasion from the West, where a large part of your own culture comes from, is a country in which you are going to be extremely interested. That is entirely in conformity to the international tradition. Now, the point is, that means that Russia treats Ukraine as a priority. What you can see, I think, from the Western approach is that it wasn't even a third-rate issue for us. The European Union, approached this whole thing with complete dilettantism and with far, far too little actual financial backing. Now, NATO, however, is much, much worse. Just think about it. America and Britain were really pushing for Georgia and Ukraine to be members of NATO. Georgia, of course, with its unsolved territorial issue, which the Saakashvili government had made absolutely clear it was going to solve sooner or later by military means. In Ukraine, we were pushing this despite the fact that every opinion poll, and that, by the way, is the reverse of the opinion polls about the European Union, every opinion poll showed between 65 and 70% of Ukrainians as opposed to NATO membership. And we were doing all this, as we've now proved twice, with no intention whatsoever of actually defending these countries.
Right.
We were proposing a military alliance, which was going to actually drastically worsen their security situation because of the way that it would,
Right. It not only invites a Russian intervention, but it also proves that NATO, it makes NATO look weak. It makes NATO's commitment to its allies or would-be allies look much more theoretical and flimsy.
Well, it makes NATO look both aggressive and cowardly at the same time.
Yes.
Now that is as anyone in a bar can tell you, who's ever been in a rougher kind of bar can tell you, that is not, a good policy to follow. So my point is, say what you like about Russian policy, Russian policy treats Ukraine seriously because Ukraine is very important to Russia. The question is, how important is it to us, and what are we, prepared to do to defend our stake there?
Well, Anatol, thank you so much. This has been really illuminating and relevant, and it's a useful perspective. I think, as I'm sure you're aware, the intellectual discourse on Russia and Eastern Europe in the United States is often, by its very nature, extremely Russophobic. And while there is plenty to criticize about Vladimir Putin and about Russia today, and I've done plenty of that criticism myself, it's there's also a lot of useful perspective that kind of gets shut out of the mainstream discussion in the U.S. So I really appreciate your taking the time.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.